Hello, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be Section C of Part 3 of Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion. Again, this is Section C, Mill's case for why supernatural religions are not optimal for securing personal happiness. For the foregoing reasons, Mill believes we ought to consider the religion of humanity a viable and perhaps preferable alternative to supernatural religions. And, in fact, Mill does think that his religion of humanity is preferable, claiming that it, quote, is not only capable of fulfilling these functions, but would fulfill them better than any form whatever of supernaturalism, end quote. Footnote 166 cites the source. Thus, Mill is convinced that his religion of humanity, along with its corresponding ideal of humanity, can not only elicit the same benefits garnered by supernatural religions, but can do so more optimally. He cites several reasons for believing this to be the case, which I will explicate in the following section. To begin with, recall the moral difficulties associated with supernatural religions, which I elaborated on in Section C of Part 2. Consider, for example, the self-interested nature of the behavior motivated by fear of hell and hope for heaven. By contrast, Mill points out that his religion of humanity is disinterested insofar as its ascendancy does not depend on the fear of eternal damnation or the hope of eternal reward. Footnote 167 cites the source. As Matz suggests, quote, morally, the religion of humanity, is disinterested, unlike vulgar Christianity, which easily tempts Christians to regard moral action as a means to personal salvation, end quote. Footnote 168 cites the source. What's more, while Mill's ideal of humanity does not depend on any hope of a reward, it still offers a reward nonetheless, namely the approbation, quote, the approbation in this world of those whom we respect, and ideally of all those, dead or living, whom we admire or venerate. End quote. Footnote 169 cites the source. Insofar as some subscribing to supernatural religions profess to, quote, worship without any perversion of the moral sentiments, end quote, Mill maintains that they do so, quote, by fixing the attention exclusively on what is beautiful and beneficent, end quote, and ignore the base and vile aspects of these religions, which reflects, quote, a torpid and inactive state of the speculative faculties, end quote. Footnote 170 cites the source. Indeed, Mill concludes that, quote, it is an immense abatement from the worth of the old religions as means of elevating and improving human character, that it is nearly, if not quite impossible, for them to produce their best moral effects unless we suppose a certain torpidity, if not positive twist in the intellectual faculties. End quote. Footnote 171 cites the source. Speaking of these intellectual faculties, Mill thinks that his religion of humanity avoids a number of intellectual difficulties associated with supernatural religions. One gets the sense that, for Mill, supernatural religions are frequently at odds with objective considerations of truth. Footnote 172. As we will see in Chapter 2, this is also a major theme in Nietzsche's The Antichrist. End of footnote 172. In this vein, Carr suggests that, quote, assuming that free discussion was the most excellent means of getting the truth on any public issue, Mill was puzzled about the denial of this method of inquiry to religion. End quote. Footnote 173 cites the source. Mill, however, does hint at an explanation for this kind of denial in the utility of religion, suggesting that, quote, many, again, having observed in others or experienced in themselves elevated feelings which they imagine incapable of emanating from any other sources than religion, have an honest aversion to anything tending, as they think, to dry up the fountain of such feelings, end quote. Footnote 174 cites the source. Similarly, this is why they also, quote, either dislike and disparage all philosophy, or addict themselves with intolerant zeal to those forms of it in which intuition usurps the place of evidence, and an internal feeling is made the test of objective truth. End quote. Footnote 175 cites the source. As a result of the intellectual difficulties involved, Mill suggests that, quote, it is time to consider more impartially and therefore more deliberately than is usually done, whether all this straining to prop up beliefs which require so great an expense of intellectual toil and ingenuity to keep them standing yields any sufficient return in human well-being. End quote. Footnote 176 cites the source. I briefly mentioned in Section C of Part 2 how the common conception of faith, whereby it comes to mean believing something despite a lack of evidence or reason, or even despite contrary evidence or reason, yields moral difficulties. It also presents an intellectual difficulty insofar as it is essentially irrational. I now turn to some other specific examples of the intellectual difficulties Mill is referring to. Consider first the notorious problem of evil, which has been widely discussed throughout the history of theology and philosophy. Many, including Mill, suggest that the problem of evil poses a problem for those who subscribe to supernatural religions because it doesn't seem logically possible to reconcile the existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent God, which is the kind of God most often, although certainly not always, embraced by such religions, with the abundant existence of evil in the world. Why would an all-loving God permit unspeakable evils to transpire at all, not to mention at the rate in which we actually find them happening, provided such a God has the power to prevent them? Thus, on the face of it, the existence of evil does not seem consistent with the existence of this kind of God. Footnote 177. To be sure, many have attempted to solve the problem. Some common solutions to the problem are: 1. We need the contrast between good and evil in order to have any appreciation or recognition of the good in the first place. 2. Evil is an unfortunate consequence of the free will God has granted us. And 3. We can't be expected to understand everything God does given our limited intelligence, and for all we know, apparent evils might prove necessary in God's greater plan. End of footnote 177. In describing the views Mill articulates in 3 essays on religion, Carr suggests that, quote, Mill was more impressed by nature's cruelty than by its beneficence, end quote, and that, quote, as Mill saw it, nature was not simply amoral but positively immoral, end quote. Footnote 178 cites the source. Footnote 179. Carr continues, quote, were not all the arts of life, and even civilization itself, he asked, direct infringements on the natural order, and hence admissions of nature's imperfections? End quote, and I cite the source. That's the end of footnote 179. Ultimately, Mill argues, quote, it is impossible that anyone who habitually thinks and who is unable to blunt his inquiring intellect by a sophistry should be able without misgiving to go on ascribing absolute perfection to the author and ruler of so clumsily made and capriciously governed a creation as this planet and the life of its inhabitants. End quote. Footnote 180 cites the source. Footnote 181. I should note that Mill does acknowledge one form of belief in the supernatural that, quote, stands wholly clear both of intellectual contradiction and of moral obliquity. End quote. And I cite the source. Namely, the one that abstains from insisting on an omnipotent creator, and that does not assign the evils present in this world to his doing. However, Mill suggests that such belief still rests on shallow evidence. More importantly for our purposes, in this case, we are talking about a God that does not resemble the kind of God implicit in most of the religions we encounter, in which case it has little effect on a utility calculation associated with how religion actually affects individuals and society. End of footnote 181. Consider, further, the problem of hell. Remember that the effectiveness of religion as an enforcer of morality is often thought to depend on the belief that there will be eternal rewards and punishments assigned for our earthly behavior. Accordingly, either God is thought to have created heaven and hell, or to enforce similar consequences in a future life, in which case religion can be thought to act as a kind of enforcer of morality, or God is not thought to have done so, in which case religion no longer inspires moral behavior by way of such eternal threats. In the first scenario, we encounter an intellectual difficulty associated with believing in and emulating a God who creates a hell, for reasons I already mentioned in section C of part 2. In the second scenario, much of the moral incentive, as well as the general social utility, traditionally associated with religions is lost. One might suggest that the idea of hell is intellectually sustainable by way of the notion of divine grace, thanks to which our earthly sins and moral errors are forgiven by God. However, here I argue that we are also faced with an intellectual difficulty. More specifically, there are problems associated with revelation and the exclusive nature of divine grace. Either God impartially offers such grace to all of us, or God does so selectively. In the first scenario, hell seems bankrupt insofar as it is, in a sense, an empty threat, since we are all to be saved by the grace of God in the end, regardless of whether we behave morally, in which case it loses its force as a moral deterrent. In the second scenario, we must face the intellectual difficulties associated with the notion of a God who is no longer impartial, and are left wondering with Mill why, quote, it is that so precious a gift bestowed on a few should have been withheld from the many, end quote, when, quote, it would have cost the divine giver as little to have vouchsafed to all as to have bestowed by special grace upon a favored minority, end quote. Footnote 182 cites the source. What's more, he considers this to be proof of, quote, one moral contradiction inseparable from every form of Christianity, which no ingenuity can resolve, and no sophistry explain away. End quote. Footnote 183 cites the source. Mill does acknowledge one apparent advantage of supernatural religions over his religion of humanity, the hope produced by the prospects of an afterlife that they promise. Along these lines, he writes that the, quote, one advantage such as it is, the supernatural religions must always possess over the religion of humanity, end quote, is, quote, the prospect they hold out to the individual of a life after death, end quote. Footnote 184 cites the source. In fact, Carr points out that in a series of articles Mill published in a paper in the 1820s, i.e. much earlier than when Utility of Religion was written, he actually argued that the fact that, quote, atheism excludes us from the blessings of a future life should surely be sufficient reason to induce every reasonable man to reject it, end quote. Footnote 185 cites the source. Furthermore, Carr adds that Mill, quote, was convinced that Christianity was a social impediment, but he sensed that also that it might be a personal necessity, end quote. And so he, quote, could not help suspecting that however wrong-headed its doctrines might be, religion was a psychological necessity without which man would lack both a sufficient sanction from morality and an ultimate hope to help him meet courageously the tribulations here below, end quote. Footnote 186 cites the source. Carr expounds on the tension between our intellectual and emotional faculties when it comes to religious belief, which, in turn, he suggests underlies much of Mill's discussion and subsequent perspective on the utility of such belief. Accordingly, the emotional satisfaction supernatural religion is thought to offer is squared against the intellectual difficulties Mill thinks it spawns, which I've just detailed. As a result, Carr argues that, quote, the conflict between intellect and emotion was never wholly absent from his religious struggles, end quote. Footnote 187 cites the source. And this tension greatly influenced the development of Mill's religious views throughout the course of his life. As we will see in Chapter 3, James has much to say regarding this tension as well. However, after acknowledging this one advantage supernatural religions appear to have over his earthly alternatives in utility of religion, Mill immediately proceeds to minimize the importance of such an advantage. First, note, once more, that there are examples of societies that have survived and thrived without belief in such an afterlife. Mill also suggests that we will care less and less about the prospect of an afterlife as we improve our condition and become more satisfied here on earth. Accordingly, he, quote, cannot but think that as the condition of mankind becomes improved, as they grow happier in their lives, and more capable of deriving happiness from unselfish sources, they will care less and less for this flattering expectation, end quote, since, quote, they who have had their happiness can bear to part with existence, end quote. Footnote 188 cites the source. Mill goes so far as to suggest that it is, quote, not only possible, but probable, that in a higher and above all a happier condition of human life, not annihilation, but immortality, may be the burdensome idea, end quote. Footnote 189 cites the source. And that we might find relief and not pain in the notion that we are not forever shackled to a conscious existence, that we have no guarantee we will always want. In an 1854 journal entry, Mill writes that, quote, the belief in a life after death, without any probable surmise as to what it would be no consolation, but the very king of terrors. A journey into the entirely unknown, the thought is sufficient to strike with alarm the firmest heart, end quote. Footnote 190 cites the source. Interestingly, Matz observes that we can interpret, quote, Mill's view as a kind of Pascalian wager, end quote. Footnote 191 cites the source, according to which it would be safer to choose non-existence than risk the infinite possibilities of eternal consciousness. Furthermore, Mill echoes Socrates, who in Plato's Apology argues that we have no reason to think of death as an evil and unwanted thing. There, Socrates suggests that, quote, the fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom, and not real wisdom, being a pretense of knowing the unknown. And no one knows whether death, which men in their fear apprehend to be the greatest evil, may not be the greatest good, end quote. Footnote 192 cites the source. Socrates believes that there is great hope that death is a good, given the two possible implications of death. A, quote, a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, end quote, or B, quote, a change in migration of the soul from this world to another, end quote. Footnote 193 cites the source. As a result, he concludes that, quote, those of us who think that death is an evil are in error, end quote. Footnote 194 cites the source. In this vein, Mill himself writes that, quote, the mere cessation of existence is no evil to anyone. The idea is only formidable through the illusion of imagination, which makes one conceive oneself as if one were alive and feeling oneself dead. End quote. Footnote 195 cites the source. In his view, all of this ultimately constitutes, quote, proof that the idea of death is not really or naturally terrible, end quote. Footnote 196 cites the source. For Mill, these reasons show that the one advantage that can be associated with supernatural religions, the hope associated with their belief in an afterlife, proves to be rather insubstantial, and all things considered, supernatural religions are less optimal than the more earthly alternatives he recommends. However, not everyone finds what Mill says in Utility Religion convincing, and Mill himself would later alter his position on the utility of belief in an afterlife. In view of this, I want to briefly address the evolution of Mill's own thoughts on the matter, as well as some scholarly criticism of the position he espouses in Utility Religion. First, I should point out, as many commentators, including Carr and Matz, have, that Mill adopts a more optimistic view regarding the utility of belief in an afterlife in his work Theism, which he wrote much later than Utility Religion. Characterizing Mill's later view, Carr writes, quote, "Though man could base only on hope his convictions about the benevolent government of the universe and about life after death, Mill would allow him to indulge that hope because of its beneficial effects. That the religion of humanity would be the religion of the future, Mill entertained little doubt, but he had come to believe also that the progress of that religion would be quickened if aided not only by intellects outraged by the moral dullness of orthodoxy, for example the problem of evil, but also by imaginations which roamed freely in the nether regions of hope and trust, where a psychologically satisfying vestige of the Christian God lived and moved and had his being." End of quote. Footnote 197 cites the source. Similarly, Matz, who argues that Mill, quote, "pressed his argument against supernatural illusions too far," end quote, in the Utility of Religion, adds that this is a point that Mill, quote, "apparently recognizes at the end of his life," end quote. Footnote 198 cites the source. As I've just indicated, Matz is one who is critical of the stance Mill takes in Utility of Religion regarding the utility of belief in an afterlife. In his article, The Utility of Religious Illusion, a critique of J.S. Mill's Religion of Humanity, Matz acknowledges that he agrees with Mill, quote, "that religious belief is not necessary for morality," end quote. Footnote 199 cites the source. But he argues, quote, "that Mill cannot dismiss the utility of hope in an ultimate justice, since it need not pervert the intellect or morality," end quote, and suggests that, quote, "there are thus utilitarian grounds to support some supernatural illusions, which undermines Mill's defense of an exclusively naturalistic religion," end quote. Footnote 200 cites the source. In support of this conclusion, Matz suggests that, quote, "Mill cannot show that such a hope, though not based on any human experience and perhaps partly inconsistent with it, should be abandoned, since it could and does inspire the commitment to the moral life without being inimical to intellectual and moral progress," end quote. Footnote 201 cites the source. He adds that, quote, "such a hope could and does, as a matter of fact, support the commitment to a moral life, and inspires perseverance during troubled times by making some sense of the disconcerting fact that the virtuous and vicious often do not get their just due," end quote. Footnote 202 cites the source. However, contrary to what Matz, as well as Mill's own considered view, suggests, and as I ultimately hope to have demonstrated in this chapter, I believe Mill does give good reasons to think that supernatural religious belief is inimical to both intellectual and moral progress. I discussed how this is true regarding the latter in section C of part 2. In my discussion of the 2 points mentioned earlier in part 3, i.e. that supernatural religion is neither necessary nor optimal for eliciting the individual utility associated with it, I have made a case for how this is true of the former as well. So again, that was section C of part 3 of chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion, from the Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.